The United States is about to spend nearly $1 trillion in defense in a single year, yet its own generals admit the country has no defense against the weapons that would decide the next war. China, by contrast, has announced a defense budget of just $277 billion for 2026, a figure so much smaller that it invites dismissive laughter from those who equate money with power. But that laughter dies in the throat when you look at what each country actually gets for its dollar. This is not a story about who spends more. It is a story about who wastes less, who builds faster, and who has designed an industrial system that turns you on into warships at a rate that makes the Pentagon's accountants weep. The United States fiscal year 2026 defense budget stands at $848.3 billion in discretionary funding, with an additional $113.3 billion in mandatory spending, pushing the total Department of Defense figure to approximately $961.6 billion. When you add broader national defense functions from other agencies, like the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons programs, the top line crosses the historic $1 trillion threshold, a sum larger than the entire GDP of but a handful of nations. China, meanwhile, officially announced a budget of nearly 2 trillion yuan, which converts to roughly around $280 billion at market exchange rates, representing a 7% increase and the 11th consecutive year of single-digit growth. On the surface, the ratio looks like 3.5 to 1 in favor of the United States, a spending advantage so massive it should guarantee absolute military dominance in every domain. But nominal dollars are a terrible measure of actual military output, because a dollar does not buy the same thing in a California shipyard that it buys in a Shanghai one. The missing variable in this comparison is purchasing power parity, a concept that adjusts for the fact that labor, materials, and industrial overhead cost dramatically less in China. When analysts at CEPR applied sector-specific PPP rates to China's defense spending using IMF data, the effective purchasing power of Beijing's military budget jumped to approximately $541 billion, or about 59% of American spending. A separate study from the China Power Project at CSIS, using a different methodology focused on military-specific cost factors, estimated China's real expenditure at roughly $471 billion, while IMF-based calculations push the figure as high as $580 to $600 billion. None of these estimates even attempts to capture the off-budget items that the Pentagon itself acknowledges Beijing hides from public view. The Pentagon's own China Military Power Report notes that China's announced budget likely undercounts total military-related spending by 32 to 63% once you include military research and development, foreign weapons purchases, and the paramilitary forces that would be on the books in any Western accounting. This means the actual gap between the two countries, measured in what their money can buy, is not 3.5 to 1, but closer to 1.7 to 1, or even narrower, which fundamentally changes the conversation about who is really outspending whom. The reason nominal dollars mislead so badly is that the American and Chinese defense economies operate on fundamentally different principles. The United States relies on a system of private defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, whose stock prices depend on quarterly profits and whose contracts are frequently structured as cost-plus. Under cost-plus, the government reimburses all expenses and adds a guaranteed profit margin on top, which creates a perverse incentive where delays and cost overruns are not failures, but revenue streams. The F-35 program, the most expensive weapons system in human history, has been in development for decades, has suffered countless technical problems, and has cost over $1.7 trillion over its projected lifetime. The Zumwalt-class destroyer was originally planned as a 32-ship class, but cost explosions reduced it to 3 ships that each cost roughly $8 billion, and the Navy still has no clear mission for them. China's defense industry operates under a completely different logic, dominated by state-owned enterprises that do not answer to private shareholders and do not need to generate profit margins to justify their existence. The China State Shipbuilding Corporation, known as CSSC, controls roughly 21% of the global commercial shipbuilding market, alongside roughly half of China's naval construction capacity, all under one roof, with combined assets exceeding 400 billion yuan, about $56 billion. This entity alone builds more commercial vessels by tonnage in a single year than the entire United States has built since the end of the Second World War, a feat made possible by the cross-subsidization of military production with civilian profits. The revenue from commercial orders subsidizes military R&D. The same workers who weld LNG carriers on Tuesday weld destroyer hulls on Wednesday, and the supply chains that feed civilian production can surge to military needs on command. The most devastating evidence of China's efficiency advantage lies not in budget tables, but in what each country actually produces. The International Institute for Strategic Studies published its Military Balance Report in February 2026, and the numbers landed like a bombshell in naval circles. Between 2021 and 2025, China launched 10 nuclear-powered submarines with a combined displacement of 79,000 tons, while the United States launched only 7 submarines, totaling 55,500 tons. For the first time in the nuclear age, China's submarine production surpassed America's, transforming a domain where the United States had enjoyed unchallenged superiority since the Cold War. China's Bohai shipyard in Huludao expanded between 1919 and 2022 with a second massive construction hall, has achieved what analysts call a 1+2 production rhythm, meaning it can build 1 ballistic missile submarine and 2 attack submarines simultaneously. On the surface, the production tempo gap is equally stark, and here the comparison of build times reveals the structural difference most clearly. The Chinese Type 055 Renhai-class destroyer, a warship displacing over 12,000 tons with over 100 vertical launch cells, typically moves from keel laying to commissioning in approximately 3 years. The American Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, by contrast, averages 5 to 6 years from start to delivery, not because American workers are less skilled, but because the yards are overwhelmed with maintenance backlogs and cannot dedicate clean production lines to new construction. The PLA Navy has grown to approximately 370 warships and is projected to reach 460 by 2030, while the U.S. Navy sits at roughly 290 ships and, by its own admission, cannot grow the fleet because each new hull barely offsets the retirement of aging vessels. American shipbuilding has been locked in what analysts call a doom loop. Fewer ships ordered means fewer workers trained, which means higher costs per ship, which means even fewer orders, a cycle that has persisted for over 20 years despite a near doubling of the shipbuilding budget. Nowhere is the gap more humiliating than in hypersonic weapons, the class of missiles that travel at over 5 times the speed of sound and maneuver unpredictably to evade interception. In April 2026, Mark Berkowitz, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, testified bluntly to Congress that the United States has no defense against hypersonic weapons or advanced cruise missiles today, describing the current ground-based system as a very limited single-layer homeland defense designed for a small-scale rogue attack from North Korea. The Congressional Research Service has confirmed that the Department of Defense has not established any program of record for hypersonic weapons, meaning there is no approved mission requirement and no long-term funding plan in place. China, by contrast, has fielded multiple operational hypersonic systems, including the DF-17, a glide vehicle designed to shred aircraft groups, and the DF-27, an intercontinental range anti-ship ballistic missile with a range of 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers that's capable of reaching all major U.S. bases in the Pacific, including Hawaii. The Pentagon's budget request for hypersonic research actually declined sharply, from nearly $7 billion in fiscal 2025 to just under $4 billion in 2026, at the very moment the threat is accelerating. The question of why China achieves more with less has been studied extensively by Western institutions, and their conclusions point to deliberate choices rather than inevitable outcomes. A recent Rand Corporation analysis contrasting the acquisition systems of the Pentagon and the PLA argued that the Department of Defense's slow pace of modernization relative to China's is influenced heavily by different approaches to setting strategic priorities, aligning resources to requirements, and making cost, schedule, and performance trade-offs that give more weight to schedule. In other words, China chooses to field good enough systems quickly, while the United States insists on perfect systems that arrive late and cost exponentially more. The Rand report concluded that China's investments have upset the conventional military balance, undermined the U.S. ability to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific region, increased the cost and risks of war if deterrence fails, and complicated U.S. policymakers' decision space. The Pentagon's own China Military Power Report, released in late 2025, reinforced these findings with striking detail about the scale of Beijing's ambitions. The report noted that China's defense budget does not contain the totality of its military spending because significant portions of research, development, and strategic investments are buried in civilian agency budgets under the military-civil fusion strategy. This strategy, known in Chinese as Jun Min Rong He, deliberately blurs the line between commercial and military production, allowing Beijing to subsidize weapons development with profits from global exports while hiding the true scale of its military buildup. The Pentagon assessment also highlighted that China is now the world's top ship-producing nation, with capacity for large numbers of submarines, surface combatants, and amphibious ships, and that its Navy recently demonstrated dual-carrier operations for the first time. When the Center for Strategic and International Studies modeled the trajectory of naval force balance, its findings projected that at current rates of construction and retirement, China will possess 475 warships by 2035, while the United States will struggle to maintain between 305 and 317, a numerical disadvantage that would fundamentally challenge America's ability to control the seas of the Western Pacific. One of the most underappreciated dimensions of China's military modernization is its aggressive pursuit of autonomous and artificial intelligence-driven warfare, particularly in the maritime domain. Chinese military researchers have published simulations demonstrating that coordinated swarms of 8 attack drones can penetrate IISS-class destroyer defenses with an average of nearly 3 successful strikes per engagement, a finding that has obvious implications for how surface fleets would fare in a Taiwan contingency. The National University of Defense Technology has been at the forefront of applying deep reinforcement learning algorithms to swarm coordination, allowing large numbers of unmanned vehicles to communicate, adapt, and attack without requiring constant human guidance. In recent exercises, the PLA demonstrated the ability to operate multiple unmanned surface vessels simultaneously, each vehicle navigating autonomously and executing intercept missions with minimal operator input, a capability the U.S. Navy's Ghost Fleet program is still years away from replicating at comparable scale. This focus on drone warfare extends to a concept that has no serious equivalent in the U.S. Navy today: the rapid conversion of civilian cargo ships into drone motherships and floating missile arsenals. The Zhong 79, a 97-meter Chinese-flagged container feeder ship, underwent a startling transformation during 2025 that was tracked by open-source intelligence analysts. When it emerged from the yards near Shanghai, satellite imagery showed it had been reportedly fitted with dozens of containerized vertical launch system cells disguised as standard shipping containers, along with a rotating phased array radar, a Type 1130 close-in weapon system for point defense, and decoy launchers. By late 2025, photographs suggested the ship had been reconfigured yet again, with analysts assessing that some missile containers had been removed and replaced by what appeared to be a vehicle-mounted electromagnetic aircraft launch system for testing fixed-wing combat drones. The Zhong 79 is not merely a test platform, it is a proof of concept for weaponizing China's massive commercial fleet, which numbers over 5,600 ocean-going cargo vessels and tens of thousands of coastal ships and fishing boats. Because the weapons and sensors are containerized and modular, they can potentially be loaded onto any suitable merchant hull in a matter of days or weeks, turning a civilian supply chain into a distributed naval combat force that would be nearly impossible to track, target, or neutralize in advance. The single most devastating piece of intelligence to emerge in recent years is the infamous Office of Naval Intelligence slide, leaked in 2023 and subsequently confirmed by Navy spokespersons, which visualizes the gap between Chinese and American shipbuilding capacity. Chinese shipyards have a combined production capacity of roughly 23 million tons, while American shipyards muster less than 100,000 tons, a ratio of approximately 232 to 1. It is crucial to understand that this figure compares total industrial maritime capacity, not exclusively naval construction, but that is precisely the point. China's dual-use model means its commercial dominance directly feeds military potential. The ONI slide specifically noted that Chinese naval surface ship producers are mixed military-commercial entities, meaning the same facilities that build container ships for global export are also building destroyers, frigates, and amphibious assault ships for the PLA Navy. The Navy Secretary himself, Carlos del Toro, told Congress bluntly that a single Chinese shipyard has more production capacity than all American shipyards combined, a statement that should echo through every budget hearing on Capitol Hill. The structural underpinnings of this gap are rooted in a decades-long collapse of American commercial shipbuilding. In 2024, China accounted for nearly 55% of global shipbuilding output, followed by South Korea at 28% and Japan at 12.6%. The United States accounted for 0.04%, ranking 19th in the world. The United States built fewer than 10 commercial ships that entire year, while China built well over 1,000. This commercial desert means American military shipyards have no civilian demand base to absorb overhead costs, maintain workforce skills during downturns, or provide the steady drumbeat of production that keeps supply chains healthy and competitive. The last time the United States had a robust commercial shipbuilding industry was the early 1980s, before federal subsidies were eliminated and the industry was exposed to global competition it could not survive. China's industrial advantage was further consolidated in late 2025 with the completion of the merger between CSSC and CSIC, the two state-owned shipbuilding giants that had previously divided military and commercial construction. The unified entity now controls just over 21% of the global order book, manages assets exceeding $56 billion, and holds a backlog of over 530 commercial vessels alongside its classified orders. At this point, a critical distinction must be made to prevent the numbers from becoming misleading.
The figure of 23 million tons refers to total shipbuilding capacity measured in gross tons, a volumetric measure of enclosed space that includes everything from massive container ships to small coastal ferries, and it is spread across hundreds of commercial and military yards. China does not produce 23 million tons of warships each year. What it does produce, according to intelligence estimates for the 2024 to 2026 period, is roughly 150,000 to 200,000 tons of naval displacement annually, a metric that counts the actual weight of water displaced by a completed warship. To put that in perspective, launching 200,000 tons of naval displacement in a single year is equivalent to christening 2 Ford-class aircraft carriers or building the entire French Navy from scratch every 12 months, a tempo of military industrialization not witnessed since the American shipbuilding surges of the Second World War. The composition of this annual output reveals the qualitative as well as quantitative transformation underway. It includes 80,000-ton aircraft carriers like the Fujian, 40,000-ton amphibious assault ships like the Type 075, and 13,000-ton destroyers like the Type 055, meaning China is now adding heavy capital-class warships at a rate no other navy can match. Meanwhile, the total displacement of the entire People's Liberation Army Navy has reached an estimated 2.4 to 2.8 million tons, still below the U.S. Navy's roughly 4.5 million tons, but the trajectory is what should alarm American strategists. The Chinese fleet is overwhelmingly less than 10 years old, while over 70% of American tonnage was built before 2010 and is approaching or exceeding midlife. The reason China can achieve this specific annual output of 150 to 200,000 tons of combat tonnage is precisely the military-civil fusion model discussed earlier, because the same Jiangnan and Dalian yards that weld together destroyer hulls are simultaneously finishing commercial megaships for the global market, maintaining a workforce and supply chain at a scale that dedicated military yards could never sustain on their own. So when you hear the phrase 232 times American capacity, understand that it refers to industrial potential, the reservoir from which naval power is drawn, but the actual annual naval output is already a terrifying 150 to 200,000 tons of combat tonnage. That is the real number you should remember, because it is the rate at which China could replace battle losses while your own shipyards are still clearing the maintenance backlog. While China accelerates, the American shipbuilding base is mired in what the Government Accountability Office has repeatedly described as systemic failures that show no signs of abating. In a scathing February 2026 report, the GAO documented that Navy and Coast Guard shipbuilding programs have consistently fallen short of expectations over the last 2 decades, collectively costing billions of dollars over budget and running years behind schedule. The Constellation-class frigate, designed to provide a cheaper and more numerous surface combatant to fill the gap left by the failed littoral combat ship, has been delayed by over 3 years and is now facing potential truncation of its planned production run because the industrial base simply cannot deliver on time. The Columbia-class ballistic missile submarine, the single most important strategic program in the American arsenal and the platform that must carry the nuclear deterrent through the middle of this century, is at least 18 months behind its original schedule, with the first boat now expected no earlier than 2028 and costs ballooning to roughly $13 billion per hull. The root causes identified by the GAO are not mysterious and have been flagged repeatedly for over a decade. Shipyards consistently begin construction before designs are mature, a practice known as concurrency that leads to expensive rework and cascading delays down the production line as changes ripple through partially built hulls. The workforce is aging rapidly, with 27% of shipyard employees over the age of 55 and an estimated shortfall of 200,000 to 250,000 workers needed over the next decade just to maintain current output. The recruitment is staggeringly difficult because shipyard work is physically demanding, often located in areas that younger workers are leaving for urban centers and perceived as less attractive than service sector or technology jobs.
The GAO observed that even if hiring miraculously accelerated, it takes 3 to 5 years for a new worker to reach adequate proficiency in the complex skills required for naval construction. The political response to this crisis has been the America's Maritime Action Plan, released by the White House in February 2026, which acknowledged bluntly that with only a handful of active shipyards, the United States cannot meet national security requirements, and proposed a Maritime Security Trust Fund financed by fees on foreign vessels. The plan also explicitly contemplates outsourcing warship construction to allied shipyards in South Korea, Japan, and even Finland, a stunning admission from the world's largest military spender that its domestic industrial base can no longer sustain its own fleet.
The efficiency gap between the United States and China is not a mere statistical curiosity. It has profound implications for the strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Military power in the 21st century is increasingly a function of industrial capacity, the ability to replace losses, sustain forces over distance, and adapt technology faster than an adversary. The United States has optimized its military for short, decisive campaigns against technologically inferior opponents, a model that collapsed in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that looks completely inadequate against a peer competitor with China's industrial depth. China, by contrast, has designed its entire military-industrial system for a long war of attrition, where the winner is not the side with the most advanced single platform, but the side that can build, repair, and replace at a higher tempo. The geography of the Pacific compounds this asymmetry. American forces must project power across thousands of miles of ocean, relying on a handful of vulnerable bases and a logistical pipeline that stretches back to the continental United States, while Chinese forces operate close to their own shores with short supply lines protected by layered defenses. Every American ship sunk or disabled must be replaced by a new hull that will take years to build and billions of dollars to complete. Every Chinese ship lost can theoretically be replaced by surging production at yards that never stopped building. This is not a war the United States is currently structured to win, and the Pentagon's own war games have repeatedly shown that even under optimistic assumptions, American forces suffer unsustainable losses in the opening weeks of a Taiwan contingency. The illusion of the trillion-dollar budget is that it creates a sense of security disconnected from the reality of industrial decline. Spending enormous sums on maintenance backlogs, contractor overhead, and a volunteer force whose compensation consumes an ever-growing share of the top line does not generate new combat power. It merely preserves an aging structure. China's smaller nominal budget, filtered through purchasing power parity and a ruthlessly efficient state-directed industrial system, generates more actual warships, more missiles, more submarines, and more drones per dollar spent. This is why the admirals are panicking, and the talk of a hollow force has moved from academic papers to congressional testimony. The balance of power is not shifting because China is richer. It is shifting because China has built a machine that converts wealth into military capability, while the United States has allowed its own machine to rust.
The data assembled here, drawn from the Pentagon's own reports, from neutral institutes like the IISS and SIPRI, from congressional watchdogs like the GAO, and from leaked intelligence assessments of the Office of Naval Intelligence, paints a consistent and deeply uncomfortable picture. The United States is spending nearly $1 trillion a year on defense and getting less combat power for it than China gets from a budget that is nominally 1/3 the size. A reality that becomes far less paradoxical once you understand purchasing power parity and the hidden off-budget spending that brings China's effective defense outlay close to 60% of America's. The shipbuilding gap stands at 232 to 1 in total industrial capacity, a number so extreme it sounds like propaganda until you realize it comes from American naval intelligence. The submarine production rate has been overtaken for the first time in the nuclear age. The hypersonic weapons that would dominate the opening salvos of a Pacific war exist in Chinese arsenals and do not exist in American ones. And the industrial workforce that built the arsenal of democracy in the 1940s has withered to the point where 7 shipyards and an aging labor pool must carry the entire burden of naval construction. The purpose of presenting this evidence is not to argue that China is invincible or that the United States is doomed. American advantages in submarine quieting, aircraft carrier aviation, undersea sensing networks, alliance structures, and combat experience are real and significant and would weigh heavily in any actual conflict. But those advantages are being eroded year by year by a system that spends too much and builds too little, that prioritizes exquisite platforms over mass production, and that treats the industrial base as an afterthought rather than the foundation of military power. The question America must answer is not whether it can afford to fix this problem. It is whether it can afford not to. A $1 trillion defense budget that cannot produce enough ships to sustain a fleet, that cannot field hypersonic weapons while its adversary deploys them in growing numbers, and that must consider outsourcing warship construction to foreign allies because domestic yards have atrophied beyond recovery, is not a deterrent. It is a monument to self-deception. And in the unforgiving arithmetic of great power competition, self-deception is the prelude to strategic defeat.